I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
Modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
Welcome to another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes. This month we're honored to have on Chris Smaje, a sociologist, writer, and farmer, a self-identified agrarian populist. So to start us off, could you explain how you define agrarian populism and how that overlaps with the distinction you make between publics and communities?
Gosh, that's a big crunchy question to to start with. I mean, I guess, like all these political terms, populist can mean many things to many different people. I guess the way I think of it is historically, kind of with the development of the emergence of the modern world, modern politics from the mid-19th century, shall we say, through to the mid-20th century. We're talking about a world where still the majority of ordinary people are farmers of one kind and another. And so a lot of politics was geared around the people, it's what populism means. But at the same time, there was this whole kind of progress structure going on, the idea of getting people out of farming, industrialization, urbanization. And so agrarian populism to me basically means a politics that's geared around agrarianism, small scale farming, the people being fundamentally oriented to small scale local production, which, has very much been the case in the past, isn't really the case in rich countries like the US or the UK here in Western Europe, is still very, very much the case in a lot of countries, but is complicated by, the nature of global food and commodity systems. Really, I think we've sort of gone through this big period in politics that has been very geared to economic development. And, we've had sort of big clash between capitalism and socialism, and we forget some of these older movements, of which agrarian populism is one. In the US, the whole history of, the People's Party and so on around the turn of the 20th century, and similar things in other countries with their own, local national characteristics. So I think given the state of the world and where politics is going, where the economy is going, it's time to look again at some of these older political ideas and sort of move out of this kind of economic progress, economic growth paradigm. And that's where I think things like agrarian populism, it's not about sort of going back to some old re-implementing exactly what that politics was about 100 plus years ago, but learning from, those times and the issues around, sort of creating dignified, employment within agriculture and within sort of local communities, and sort of trying to apply that in the present day with an eye on the future. Sorry, I forgot the second part of your question. Something
Publics versus communities.
Right. So, I mean, I guess essentially a public is something that's created in the context of a centralized modern political system. We sort of have a very centralized top-down forms of governance worldwide, really. The idea of the nation state, where the lawmakers in Washington DC or London or wherever sort of exert this smooth power over the whole country, and there are sort of nodes of local politics. Perhaps in the USA you have more of that in terms of the sort of state versus federal distinction than we do, say, here in the UK. But nevertheless, it's still very, very centralized, and the idea of a public is of a kind of citizenry that's oriented to making claims against that centralized state, whereas a community is a more bottom up, more diffuse. It's a group of people who actually might interact with each other in sort of face to face in real space, in real work. A public, when you talk about the public, you basically mean ordinary people like me, but people you're never actually going to meet. It's the whole of the US population, or or whichever country we're talking about. So part of this also is about reconstructing the importance of community, not just as a kind of fuzzy feel good word. It's nice to do good things in the community, but communities as real political entities, that are generating politics and economics, generating well-being bottom up, which is not an easy thing to do necessarily, and involves conflicts of various kinds, and real politics. But yeah, that's essentially it. The difference, I would say, is sort of top-down versus bottom-up framing.
I know we're going to want to talk more about that, especially community and community forming, but just for the sake of our listeners, how do you see the state of the world? Your latest book is called Finding Lights in the Dark Age. That was published in late 25. And so, you describe a certain type of dark age. So I was wondering if you could kind of briefly lay out how you see what's going on right now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I sort of draw on the older history of dark ages, and I sort of try and play with that a little bit in the book, because the way, the term has become a little bit disreputable amongst historians, because it sort of creates a sort of misleading image in many ways. But, the idea is, the classic example might be the collapse of the Roman Empire in Europe, and suddenly, deurbanization, sort of centralized political control collapses. All sorts of aspects of the economy that had been underpinned by the Roman Empire falls apart. And, the voices that come down to us about that tend to be sort of elite voices from the center saying, oh no, this is terrible, it's all fallen apart. But the evidence sort of basically shows that for ordinary people, dark ages are not necessarily such bad times. Military conscription, taxation, various forms of state power and state violence tend to weaken. And it sort of exactly bears on that public versus community point, that people are better able to generate livelihood and politics bottom up. The trouble we have now is that, all of those previous dark ages occurred in a time when, linking to the previous question, most people were farmers. Most people had access to land, sort of knew how to farm. Looking at the world today, if the existing economic and political structures were to suddenly collapse, most people would be in big trouble in terms of just meeting the sort of basic physical requirements of daily life. But that, I think, is going to happen. I mean, we're sort of seeing it happen in all sorts of ways. Energy futures, climate change, sort of water, soil, sort of global economic commodity chains. The whole sort of geopolitical tensions that we're seeing, previously were based on a model of sort of smooth economic growth, expanding global trade, expanding commodification, globalization, and so on. All of these things are now sort of in question, going back into the mixer. It's very hard for any of us to predict exactly how things will play out. But I don't see I don't see any simple solutions, and it's a sort of complex people call it a polycrisis or a meta-crisis, or some people talk in terms of wicked or super wicked problems. I mean, there's this whole complex of somewhat related and somewhat independent factors that really can't be solved with sort of smooth, rational, traditional mainstream policy making. And some of these are kind of technical things about energy, for example. How do we move away from fossil fuels and decarbonize while still living our very high energy sort of urbanized modern lifestyles? Other things are about politics and the legitimacy of centralized states and the kind of politics and political parties that we've been accustomed to in recent decades are manifestly falling apart in most countries, and so that leads to some pretty fundamental problems, which I certainly don't claim I have the answers to. And, in some ways, I think that's part of the problem, is that everybody, thinks that there are sort of simple solutions that we can just kind of pull out from existing politics or existing technological means. So I think what's going to happen is a lot of crises, really, and we've seen that in sort of patchy ways, the financial crisis, the Greek financial crisis, various or sort of natural disasters of one kind, or so-called natural disasters, where people suddenly, things fall apart and people suddenly have to sort of innovate bottom up ways of just meeting basic needs. I mean, that is difficult and scary, but it's out of those kinds of situations that I think new ideas and new kinds of politics and economics can emerge. So generally this is the way that history unfolds. Crisis in the center leads to new structures coming in from somewhere that was more peripheral. So that's sort of roughly the way I'd frame it. I mean, there's different ways I play with the idea in the book, but one of them certainly is that we have this very populous world which is distributed kind of in accordance with the main nodes of previous economic and political power, so the huge populations in places like Los Angeles or New York or London, and not many people in places where there's good farmland or abundant water resources. So long term, I think we're going to see population movements, and it's just how that happens, how we manage that. There are some very dark outcomes possible that we're already seeing in many ways in the contemporary world. So it's a matter, I think, of not hanging on to those older models, older ideas of how we do things, and trying to sort of face the reality of the future in a way that, you know, that doesn't just become collapse and chaos, but actually enables us to you know, generate good community, good livelihoods and so on. But that's where it does come back to agrarianism, you know, that old narrative that farming is, you know, is something that's now taken care of by you know, by all sorts of high-tech means, and, you know, we're all going to be living in cities doing non-agrarian jobs. You know, I just don't think is the way it's going to play out. But, you know, that is a big, it's difficult to sort of make that argument and have people take it seriously, because, you know, we've just grown up with this kind of progress, urbanization, sort of high energy, globalization kind of narrative. But, you know, that part of the argument of the book is that we really need to let go of that.
So would it be fair to say your attempt to be a responsible actor in this situation has been to go back to the land? And how has that gone for you?
Yeah, I mean, it has been to a degree, to try and practice what I preach. So, I mean, I did used to live in London. I was an academic based at the university. My wife and I bought a bit of land in Somerset, southwest England, about 100 miles west of London, and we've set up, ultimately what we've done is set up a small community on the land that has involved various bureaucratic obstacles, and done a lot of work to diversify it. And we've sort of got this mixed holding now with woodland and cropland. We grow vegetables that we sell locally, and grassland, a little bit of livestock, and that I think is an important thing that we need to think about in terms of the sort of agricultural or material practicalities of it. That you know, every part of the world, through modern high tech, high energy sort of global commodity systems, has specialized into producing, you know, just a handful or maybe even one sort of local agricultural product. And, you know, stuff like forestry has been pushed out to the margins, and we need to reintegrate all of this, you know, people, cropland, woodland, grassland, and wild, you know, wilderness or wild creatures too. So we've done our best to do what we can locally along those lines. We set up a little commercial market garden nearly 20 years ago now, just producing vegetables for sale locally, and that's still going. I mean, originally it was me that was the main grower, and then my wife, and we've now handed it on to younger people who've got a bit more energy than we do now. But it's difficult. You know, it's difficult making that kind of stuff work in the context of the mainstream economy, which, you know, as I said, very much in rich countries, energy tends to be cheap. You know, diesel is cheap, human labor is dear. Something like, you know, growing local vegetables, you know, we're very much competing either with countries where labor is cheaper, or, you know, or big enterprises that import cheap labor. You know, anything that can be mechanized gets mechanized. And so part of how I got drawn back into writing in recent years was, you know, we kind of know how to do all this stuff. You know, the basics of producing good local livelihood are not that difficult, but the economic system and the political system really don't make it easy for people to do it. And partly I got drawn back into sort of writing books like Finding Lights, just to sort of try and get my head around sort of why that is, and what we might be able to do about it. But yeah, for sure, we try our best within the limits of the existing system to to produce some food and to both for ourselves but also for wider sale.
Yeah, and I was pleased because I'm a market gardener in eastern Kansas City, Missouri, and
Right.
I'm from western Kansas originally, like Dodge City area, and I feel so, in a way, when people come around, they come suffused with seeing YouTube videos about how you can make $100,000 on a third of an acre.
Yeah.
And your discussion specifically, I never quite thought about the reality that real estate and living space is too expensive, and labor and food is too cheap. And so market gardeners were caught in this like bind where we can never pay people enough for them to live, especially by, I think you used the term like a managerial salary. Can you talk a bit about that?
I mean, for one thing, you're right that there's a lot of this kind of easy solutionism around, in the alternative farming sector as well as everywhere else. So, there's a lot of books about, like you say, how you can make, $100,000 from, growing garlic or whatever. And, if it was that easy, there'd be a lot of people, growing garlic, So, you've got to take that stuff with a pinch of salt. But the reality is, I mean, that is exactly the sort of economic bottleneck that we're in, is that food prices are very, very low, and that's partly a result of largely a result of cheap energy and cheap labor in certain parts of the world, and the ability to ship. If you're producing food and selling it locally, you are now, in a way that was never the case historically, you are competing with whoever in the world can produce that same thing most cheaply, using whatever, kind of chemical and energetic and labor and land inputs they can. And that's why, we've got a lot of tremendously environmentally destructive farming going on in places where it shouldn't be going on, rather than, more localized agricultures where, people are producing for their own communities and having to sort of bear the consequences of what they're doing. It's part of this is about a sort of energy prices, as I was just saying, being artificially low. Labor prices are very high, but particularly land, the cost of land and housing. So much of the modern global economy is essentially a speculative one, sort of built on inventing money, essentially built on cheap money, which finds its way into property values. So most ordinary people are, paying through the nose to get a roof over their head. Enormous problems of housing shortage and economic inequality. So that creates a pressure on food prices staying low. But there's a lot of kind of perversities in that kind of economic structure. I mean, the food system is the major employer globally of people, and poverty is disproportionately concentrated in the food sector. So food prices need to be higher. That will benefit, that will benefit the poor. But obviously, a lot of people who are poor and don't have access to food, who are directly, who are living, paying through the nose with expensive accommodation, that's not going to work for them. So, all of these things connect together. If we're going to talk about food prices, we have to talk about energy prices, land prices, housing prices, and the money prices, ultimately, the cheapness of money for those who already have it, and the lack of the ability to get money for those who don't. And you can't, I suppose I've started in my writing from a agrarian perspective, but this ultimately isn't an agrarian problem. It's a kind of whole society problem. So often the way this figures in debates in food and farming is that we need to make food affordable. And I suppose my argument is that ultimately it's not the job of farmers to make it affordable or to produce cheap food. It's a wider political task to create access to the forms of well-being, of which food is obviously a critical one, to make that widely available to people. But yeah, the sort of race to the bottom in global food production that, just pushes people out of farming, makes it impossible to sort of really make a good income. It creates a lot of difficulties in the farming system. And you do get the pioneers. Typically it's people in relatively, you can run you can maybe make some money running a small market garden in a relatively wealthy city if you have sort of wealthy customers. But that's kind of not how any of us really got into this. It's not about growing fancy herbs or berries for rich people. It's more of a sort of bottom up movement for producing good, healthy food within our communities, and we can't really do that without really fundamental change to the economic structure of ultimately access to land or and access to housing. And that's where some of, again, the old agrarian populist ideas or the distributist ideas from Catholic social teaching and so on, I've found really informative, and they've really been sidelined in modern politics. But I think it's time to look at them afresh.
Yeah, and it seems to me part of why this is such a vexed topic is because we don't have any kind of positive conception of poverty. When people hear poverty, they hear dissolution and precarity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the idea of voluntary poverty or simplicity it's very, very marginal at best within sort of modern thinking. So yeah, the idea of sort of frugality has been a really big part of most cultures historically, and you could say, well, out of necessity, but that we don't have that anymore in modern society, and that, in a way, I think that's not entirely true, and we clearly do have an awful lot of precarity, and so much of the wealth of modern times is based on the want and the poverty and the suffering of others. But as you say, it's individualized, and that's part of the problem. That a lot of movements of voluntary poverty historically have been collective movements. It's a lot easier to live a frugal life if you're part of wider communities that are doing that rather than just in a sort of individualized way. And they've also, they've often had a religious component which has been valued by the wider society. I guess the sort of classic extreme example is monasteries. The life of kind of spiritual contemplation and material poverty that the wider society supports, because of the spiritual value of it. And yeah, we very much lost that in modern society, and it is problematic for sure. And I think we need to, there is a place for markets and money and sort of entrepreneurs and economic connection, but we've just allowed that to get way out of control and sort of put all our eggs in that basket and not really validated or valued the ordinary folks producing, connecting locally. We've put all our faith in the market and as a sort of abstract global phenomenon, and not as an actual place where you bring produce, meet other people, earn a fair return for your work in return for the work that other people do, and with a sort of consciousness of how that fits into your local community and the local ecology. So absolutely, yeah, I think another thing we can learn from the past is the idea of voluntary simplicity, and an emphasis on sort of frugality of material life and more kind of spiritual connection that's very much been lost in modern times.
And so like that kind of brings me to this question, because a lot of people I think one of the more frustrating aspects of our experience has been that a lot of people who say that they're kind of ready for that, whether they're localists or environmentalists or just progressives of various kinds, when they're confronted with, but, will you accept any degree of discipline? For instance, getting most of your produce locally and paying a little bit more for it if you can afford that, which many people can. Or cooperating in some way beyond the very easy level of cooperation, right? Where you actually need to rely on other people and they need to rely on you. Many times that falls apart very easily, I assume, because we just have options right now. We have options and we're sort of conditioned to instinctually want them because that's been the way we've lived our entire lives. So they fall apart. But you're describing a situation where your farm, Spencer's farm, they need to kind of hang on in the interim and survive. And if you can't count on folks that say they get it, it's hard. So I'd like to know how you've tackled that, both with, and whether it's your customer base or the people that work with you on the farm. How do you handle the tendency for people to go their own way or to only go a very small way and then back off?
Well, it's difficult, and the model in contemporary society is very sort of individualized and very sort of money based and quantified. So I mean, I wouldn't say we have solved that. In some ways I got a bit burnt out as a grower, sort of trying to square those circles, and that's partly what sort of took me back to writing to try and figure it out. And you do see, it's really interesting when you look at historic agrarian societies, the way they organize themselves, and it's a difficult thing to do, but it's easier when you have no other option, to sort of develop a mixture of household-based production with wider commons that you need to work with other people to manage the wider landscape. That's always difficult, but it's fascinating to see the way that good successful commons have developed because they had to, and people had to sort of think through how do we do all this, and there are examples of people doing that now, but as you say, it's kind of easy to walk away, because of the sort of monetized, globalized kind of economy that we have. And it's also, it's hard not to participate in that system. I mean, I kind of I sort of resisted getting a smartphone for many years, and then it just became kind of impossible to sort of communicate with anyone or sort of live a modern life without it. So you get, so and that's one of those kind of vicious cycles you get in. I mean, and that's where I think these things do start falling apart, and then that's when the impetus to innovate something different comes. But yeah, it's very difficult, and historically there was a lot of the importance of sort of non-economic relationships, whether that's in terms of family or in terms of sort of goods in kind and sort of gifts and structures or religious distributions of goods. And now we've got into this very sort of quantified, commodified world that is hard, as as Spencer was alluding to, paying for, how do you pay minimum wage to people in a labor intensive small farming system where the whole structure of it isn't geared to that. I mean, in a way, the way that we've gone is to sort of not to even try, and to partly move more towards just producing for the needs of ourselves and the community here, and partly sort of drawing in sort of volunteers and people who are, looking for some other kind of experience. But, it's a different model to the sort of business model where you're needing to sort of, you need employees who know what they're doing to sort of crank out the product sort of thing, and there's things we've tried, like we have a solidarity box where, going back to your question about the richer people who can afford it, people who can afford to pay a little bit over the odds for their produce pay more, so that people who can't afford can then get produce at a subsidized rate. So we've done things like that, but I wouldn't claim that these are just like small little kind of pinpricks in the larger system. So I think it does take a real mindset change. And part of the problem is that across the mainstream political spectrum, we sort of have got into this techno fix economic growth, this idea that, everybody needs to be and can get richer, and it's all about developing the productive forces, developing new forms of energy and new types of food. And really, it isn't, it's about developing human relationships, all of these sorts of things we've been talking about. And that, that will be in a less materially, wealthy, abundant kind of situation, but there's so much that we lose in that situation as well, and so much that that we gain by local connection with people, that I think it's a little bit of it's kind of an old story that's sold to us, that nobody wants to be on the land, everybody wants to be working in the city, and it's clearly not true. And when you talk to people, they want to be working on the land. They want to be connecting with other people. And that is happening more and more in different ways by default almost, but we're a long way from where we need to be. And, I don't know what the answer is, but I think amplifying the nature of the crisis that we're in, the poly crisis, the fact that I wrote a previous book saying no to a farm-free future. You read all these sort of ideas about sort of high-tech factory-based production of food, and as soon as you start looking into them, it immediately becomes apparent that it's pie in the sky. But that stuff, it gets relentlessly pushed. It has it has a lot of corporate push behind it, and so we really need to be pushing these other narratives: the agrarian populism, the distributism, the idea of community connection, and so on. And it can all sound a bit sort of fuzzy and wishy-washy, but ultimately, again, a look at history shows that these sorts of systems have worked well over the long term, and they're not, and they do require work, and they can fail in various ways. So they need careful thinking rather than just sitting back and assuming that people's goodwill and community will win out. But we really need to be pressing these other narratives, because the sort of top-down economic growth techno-fix narrative really is leading us into a lot of difficulties.
Could we, for a little bit, talk about your friendly neighbor Cato?
Right, yes.
Because 10 years ago, I would have been fully listening to, or fully agreeing with everything you're saying, and I was on board. Let's go out, be the change we want to see in the world. And now every neighbor I meet, I'm like, "Are you a Cato? Are you at the end of the day?" Even if they're like more friendly, and it's not just Cato, it's, are you a Cato or are you a Monbiot kind of guy that you critiqued in your last book? That when push comes to, you say you want to be a comrade, but when push comes to shove, are you a Monbiot or a Cato? Anyway, that's I'm jumping ahead of it, but tell us about Cato and what you would say.
Yeah, it's funny. I can't remember there's so many stories I could tell about Cato. I can't actually remember the
He,
one I mentioned in
he,
the book. Can you?
he was the one. He wanted to know if burning wood was good or bad.
Oh yeah,
It was
yeah,
the
yeah, yeah,
headline.
yeah.
And then, and you say it
Yeah,
became a thing in your family. Which
yeah,
we do similar things around here. These sort of stupid social traumas become like symbolic of the
yeah,
impacts of our lives. And yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Well, there's a couple of things going on there. I mean, I think, one aspect of humanity, which is sort of is a good aspect. Well, I think there's almost like this dual nature of people. Like, on the one hand, we love to create pecking orders and hierarchies and, say that, we're, us kind of people are better than those kind of people. And obviously we can understand a lot of human history through that. Another side of it, though, is that we like to pull down those hierarchies and sort of question people and point the finger at hypocrisy and so on. So you get a lot of that with environmentalism. It kind of goes back to Laurie's question, I suppose, about how we operate in the modern world. Nobody is kind of free of modernist sin or sort of fossil fueled sin. So it's very easy for someone to say, oh, you're claiming to be this this neo-agrarian environmentalist. What about this? What about that? And I think that comes. It can come from different places. Often I don't think it comes from particularly good motivation, but I think the motivation to take people down a peg or two isn't always a bad motivation, but it does tend to trip up the environmentalist movement, or the whole idea of moving towards voluntary simplicity and localism. It's not about claiming that we're these sort of saints, or that we're more abstemious and more in control of our consumerist desires than anyone else. It's about trying to pioneer new approaches collectively. So I sort of think we need to cut each other more slack, and partly it's about not overclaiming for one's own achievements and being open to people taking us down a peg or two, but also not being too the whole sort of personal carbon footprint thing can go too far, and not trying to be fellow travelers on a difficult journey, rather than creating these pecking orders over who's better than who in that process. The other aspect of this, though, I think is the wood example is a good one. That I often think you'll get a bit of research that probably is correct and makes sense within its own context, and then it sort of gets generalized. So that wood, good or bad thing, is a case in point. Like, here in the UK, we're sort of importing large amounts of pelletized wood from all over the world, including from the US, and burning it in power stations and claiming that it's that this is kind of ecologically sound. It's biomass, it's not fossil fuels. And then you'll get a study that says, well, actually this actually isn't a good way of organizing the energy system, and a whole bunch of other issues with it as well, in terms of particulate emissions and so on. Burning wood in cities is not good for air quality and sort of lung health and so on. So you get this whole narrative that burning wood is a bad thing, which in many contexts it is. Whereas in our situation, living in the countryside, surrounded by woodland that we've planted ourselves, that we can harvest sustainably in order to produce heat and hot water, is not such a bad thing. And that might not be a complete solution to global energy issues, but it's a pretty good local solution to our energy issues, and it makes sense to do it. But because we get into these overgeneralized applications of research findings and, all these sort of narratives that, electric cars, good or bad, renewables, whatever. And you have to really sort of drill down very deep into them to sort of really get your head around all the issues, and they end up just being these kind of sound bites. Wood burning stoves, terrible idea. Well, they're not. They're not always. They can be in particular contexts. So I think we need to get smarter in general about how we interpret this kind of data and where it leads, because the alternative to something like a wood burning stove is very high tech modern stuff like air source heat pumps that require enormous amounts of electrical energy. They might be net energy positive, but they also have a lot of kind of high tech modern parts that require energy both in manufacture and use. And so again, it becomes this techno-fix narrative. You get pushed down this route that actually, you might think that good old-fashioned wood burner is a good way to go, but actually the science shows otherwise, and it's not that simple. And there's a whole bunch of other issues around, to what extent can we generate all the energy that we need through, renewable centralized sources? What are the kind of supply chains and future commodity bottlenecks with all this stuff? So yeah, we need to get beyond wood, good or bad, and sort of have more subtle conversations about all of these kind of things.
Right. But in the process, using this Cato example, there's all this highfalutin questions about carbon, whatever. And then it all gets filtered into the culture war, and
right.
You're like the liberal, wealthy out of towner, and invading his local space. And you write, I'd like to learn from his local knowledge and appreciate his sense of humor, and I'd like to be more than boilerplate in someone else's self-justifying story. Sometimes our inability to see the real people in front of us troubles me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, that is a problem with contemporary politics, is that we tend to sort of, deal with people as kind of cardboard cutout, the Greens, the left, the far right, whatever. And we kind of don't see people as real people. But when you do interact with someone as a face-to-face local interaction, it's unfortunate if we replicate that sort of stuff rather than being able to, to sort of connect with people as people. I mean, I do come from a kind of urban, suburban sort of, eco lefty kind of background. And certainly I've let go of some of that, sort of moving to a more rural situation, to a kind of an area where there's a lot of farming in sort of interacting. I'm never going to be one of the local farming community, but the other side of it is that there are positive interactions with people. People see that you're trying to do something on the land, and farmers can be quite sympathetic to that, and that it's also generated good connections. But yeah, it does trouble me that we increasingly the contemporary politics, and that's partly driven by stuff like social media, which is the epitome of non-face-to-face, non-local, non-community based communication. We tend to get worked up by people who are in this wrong category that we want to put down, and then it becomes hard to have conversations even about wood burning stoves or whatever can become a sort of a political flashpoint, and it would be good to try and get beyond that for sure.
So in reading your latest book, I definitely resonated with the description of the breakdown that we're experiencing. Like, governments are bigger than ever, it seems like, in one way, right? They're ever bigger, but yet they can get less done. They get in each other's way, different parts of them, get in each other's way. It seems like the more that they cut, the bigger it gets. I'm not sure how that works. And then, like in my own institution, I'm seeing it at a micro level where it's big, it's got a lot of there's a lot of layers of bureaucracy. They're getting in each other's way. And one thing that you describe, which I think is true, is that it, in some cases, it gives you more freedom because the particular, like the institution has become incapacitated by itself, which then allows you to be sort of a free agent if you want to be, in a way. I was wondering if you could kind of reflect on, I mean, am I describing your intent in your own description of kind of where the governments are at this point in time? Because it seemed to be saying they're deteriorating, they're like losing capacity, and so that gives us more freedom to operate.
Yes, I mean, I think that I talk about different models of politics in the book, and I think the emergence of the modern world system has been very much geared around centralized governance, as I was saying earlier in our discussion, and there's almost like this kind of implicit contract between citizenries and governments, which is that governments will provide the services that people want, sort of health services, education, various kinds of social service, in return for us kind of towing the line, paying our taxes, sort of doing what we're told. Increasingly, governments are servicing, partly those needs are growing bigger, but governments are increasingly servicing the needs of the sort of global financial system, which has always been sort of, creaming off as much as it can. And it's sort of getting, that kind of, the German thinker Wolfgang Street calls it the consolidation state, this sort of consolidation of corporate power, whether we're talking about private corporations or the kind of corporate nature of the public sector. So for one reason and another, people are sort of getting less and less out, whilst essentially paying more and more in, and there's sort of issues of growing inequality that we were touching on earlier, and so on. And so there comes a point, I think, when you do get a crisis of legitimacy. It's sort of like, okay, I will pay my taxes and toe the line if I'm getting these services. If I'm not, then the thing starts to fall apart, and that's not a great situation to be in politically. It's a time when it's very easy to scapegoat people who are often victims rather than perpetrators of all this. It's very easy to get involved in resource wars or big geopolitical distractions, or the US versus China or Iran or whatever, and then all the politics around access to energy and critical resources as well sort of kick in. And there's not much that any of us as individuals or just in our small sort of areas of agency, our small organizations can do about that. But I think it is a time that calls upon us, partly to not to be dealing in those stereotypes and that kind of very fractious politics, but to try and generate community, to try and work across those divides. But also the fact that we will have to innovate, really basic social care, social services, education, even healthcare, or certainly social care of various kinds. The existing model is just palpably not delivering those things. That's not necessarily great, but it does generate opportunities to reconfigure the system, which will have to be reconfigured ultimately in one way or another anyway. I think there are opportunities there. It's not, my vision is not a particularly comforting, positive one. I'm not saying it's great. Just roll our sleeves up and generate all this stuff bottom up, because the nature of the contemporary world has been so created in the image of that high energy, highly monetized, highly globalized and sort of disarticulated kind of economy. So it's a massive job and all sorts of problems. But that, I think, that's where the innovation is going to come from, and that's where the possibilities lie. Including in, I talk about the idea of open country in the book, people essentially finding the places where they can find peace and prosperity, and that to some extent will be quite basic agrarian stuff, good soils, access to water, and so on. And how do we then, how does that work socially? Who's already there, who are the incomers? That can play out in some very negative ways, but also in potentially positive ways, like the sort of mainstream farming sector in a lot of wealthy countries. I mean, even big mainstream farmers are not really making any money, not really sort of alienated from the existing system, looking to connect with new entrant people with different ideas, looking to build kind of micro enterprises on their farms and so on. So it's really just sort of, let's get into that kind of world. Let's get into generating these new kind of relationships, and in a way get out of some of that older politics, which is either, the market, the sort of capitalist sort of big systems sort of economy is going to make us all wealthy, or a kind of big corporate sort of socialism, kind of welfare bureaucracy kind of idea, which ultimately is based on the same model of economic growth, so nobody really knows how to degrow. Obviously there's the whole degrowth movement, which is interesting, but doesn't necessarily have any particularly great answers as to how we do this. But that's what we need to do. But we need to do it piecemeal. We need to do it, again, a dark age kind of framing. It's not like we necessarily have a really clear idea. We just need to do A, B, and C, and then it will be fine. We all just have to sort of blunder about in the dark a bit and do the things that seem right to us. And some of those things will not work. Some places will fall into difficult crises, but generally we all have to sort of put our hands to the wheel as we see fit, and out of that, hopefully some of these experiments will work, and we will begin to see some kind of bottom-up change.
You write that we need to stop believing that state sovereignty is geared to benefiting ordinary people. And it seems to me that where a normal American that I've encountered, where they at the end of the day, they could, however sympathetically they could be listening to us, they can't imagine cutting that cord, because they're all in somewhere in the 5 stages of grief of trying to see how could we keep most of the comfort. And then on the other side, the people that do comfort that, or do cut the cord, if you will, and they're ready to be on the frontiers, there's probably something deeply psychologically wrong with them, I've found. Can you speak to this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think, in the global north, in the rich countries, governments are still quite effective. And we see this in stuff like energy crises. They're quite effective at grabbing the resources for themselves, and therefore still being able to, effectively keep the lights on, sort of make people feel that implicit contract with government is still worthwhile. It's better to have the government than not in the US, I guess, or in Western Europe. In other places, that kind of is the case worldwide, and that partly has arisen out of a lot of historical work to destroy other possibilities and to sort of create a kind of national mythologies around, the state and the nation and so on. But I think and so you're right, the difficulty here is that I think we're still in very early stages of this, where the kind of stuff I'm saying probably doesn't resonate with most people, and my fear is that by the time it does resonate, it's gonna be too late. It's going to be very hard to, it's like John Michael Greer's sort of soundbite about collapsing now to avoid the rush. It's better to get ahead of the game. But then, as you say, some of the people who are collapsing now, I guess there's the whole sort of prepper edge of this, which is not very community oriented. It's sort of like holding up with a big gun and a mountain of tinned food. Ultimately is not the way that that we're going to get out of this. But I think there's a role for sort of mavericks and pioneers and sort of people doing something different, and that does start to draw people in. But again, coming at it from an ecological or agrarian perspective, because we're still almost in this kind of entrepreneurial, this sort of old style, look at my great new system for growing garlic or whatever. I think it's really important not to oversell claims for, how we've developed, new systems of doing things, new ways of doing things. I mean, ultimately, there aren't new ways of doing things. Farming is a very old business, and historically, most people were on the land working to produce their food because ultimately we're relying on sunlight, which is diffuse, and therefore we have to be diffuse, and we just have to kind of skim those flows. And any sort of claim that no, we don't have to do that, we can going back to what you were saying earlier, that we can live these high energy modern urban lives, and I don't think they are going to, that's not going to be the case long term. We've just lived, the difficulty is that we've lived in this brief moment of world history with availability of abundant cheap energy that's kind of made us think this is some developmental trajectory forever. So yeah, on the one hand, people that are that are sort of thinking outside of that box, like me, are probably seem pretty crazy. And most people are still beneficiaries, as certainly I am, of the existing system. So, that is a real difficulty. The only way I see forward is educating ourselves and learning through the emerging crises that, certainly are at our door, and for many people are already at our door. But, the difficulty is if it manifests in ways that are sort of individualizing, that just create poverty and precarity, or create very oppositional politics, the politics of scapegoatism or so on. So, as I say, these are the things that we have to guard against.
I think there's going to be an incredible amount of corruption, and corruption's just going to get bigger because it's got more opportunity to do so. So, I mean, among the free agents out there are people who just will take advantage of the level of incoherence that exists right now. So I'm sure we're seeing that in the mix. But I wanted to ask you, just like sort of at a philosophic level, do you think it's possible for people's character to kind of snap back into place? Because, I mean, that's a serious question. In other words, how do you see human nature? Because I think that there's been a real slide in the past few decades, at the very least, maybe longer, but definitely in the past few decades, just in the character area. I can only speak for the United States, but I tend to think it's a little bit more general problem where, just to give one example, you can count on 60% of your class, if not more, using, AI, even if you tell them not to in an assignment. So therefore you can't make the assignment. That, I feel like that's gotten worse. Now, tell me if I'm wrong, but first of all, do you agree that it's gotten worse? And then if you do, is it possible that when confronted by a different set of realities, people's character could snap back?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think I don't think character has necessarily changed fundamentally. I think most people, I mean, it's partly that we are, we are quite oriented to doing right by the small group of people around us, and part of the whole modern thing has been to sort of create these vast networks in which that is kind of taken away from us, or almost that becomes the definition of corruption if you're just sort of looking out for your own locally, and that has been accompanied with this kind of ideology. It's almost the sort of Adam Smith ideology of capitalism, is that if you selfishly look out for your own interests, then somehow magically that benefits everybody. If you maximize your profits, it kind of generates economic growth that benefits everybody. And we're seeing the kind of demise of that. That's kind of worked itself out through global history over the last few centuries in basically fairly catastrophic ways, but with enough of a sort of grain of truth to it in some places for us to believe it. So then the idea is, look out for number one. And but I don't think that's really fundamentally where most people are at. And that, so I kind of think, I suppose, to answer your question, I think, yes, we can snap back into the kind of character that we need to generate local well-being and community, but we are prone to these other narratives and prone to sort of scapegoating and conflicts of various kinds, and so it can go in different ways. But there are, as you mentioned, stuff like AI. I mean, there's any number of ways in which the sort of existing anti-human system or anti-local system, creates temptations for us that are, I think, people have generally a fundamentally decent character, but we're all flawed. We're all, we're all kind of selfish egotists, or at some level, that is also always part of our character. And so the trick really is to generate, is to create systems that don't pander to those bad aspects of our character, and build the better aspects, and that's not straightforward, because all of these things sort of are sort of multiply, sort of have multiple meaning. If you cleave very selflessly to your local group, that can generate conflicts with other people, other groups, so it's not a simple thing, but we do need to do that. But I also think even the way you frame the question has almost sounds a little bit old-fashioned to modern thinking. The idea of a constant character, or the possibility of certain human characteristics that need to be restored or snapped back to, as opposed to this kind of global marketplace of people sort of meeting their wants and satisfying their egos. But I think you're right to ask the question, that it's a real fundamental problem with the modern world, and that's why some of these old sort of left-right politics start to break down, because that idea of kind of restoring traditional character is not something that, as sort of coming out of a sort of somewhat left-wing background as I do, wouldn't have been a question I would have felt comfortable with, but it is now. I just think we need to sort of some of these older ideas, again, the politics of distributism or civic republicanism that emphasized these sorts of ideas, I think are really important to go back to, rather than these ideas of sort of mass development and sort of kind of mass individualized culture, perhaps with a strong centralized state keeping it all in check, that sort of, centralized political authority versus atomized, individualized masses, is a kind of modern idea that we need to let go of, and that does create space then for questions like yours, the return of character, the return of community. Doesn't make them easy to answer, but at least we'd be sort of on the right track if we focus on that. So I mean, I am optimistic. I don't think there's any sort of fundamental or at least, I don't know, not yet. Maybe I'm naive, all the stuff about AI and social media and so on. Maybe we have sort of got into this situation of terminal brain fog, that will prevent us. But at the moment, I remain optimistic that, that there is a sort of fundamentally positive, sort of cooperative human character that we can draw on.
Yeah, reading the book, if I'd read this 15 years ago, I would have been totally on board. And now, as I've gotten increasingly religious, specifically Catholic, I first heard of you. Part of my conversion was encountering Tradiste and Sean Demensik.
Right.
Helping push me down this direction. But now I increasingly feel like the only way I can square the behavior and the psychology of the people I've encountered, both sort of in the mainstream world and in the alternative farming scene, is like, we need some sort of sacramental regeneration. We need to be born again, because you're right. I'm not denying that at a natural level, we don't have consciences. And, when crises, decision points present themselves, we can choose to do the best thing. But man, a lot of time people choose the wrong thing and they'll pull you down. It's convinced me of the classical theory of evil, like privation, non-being.
Right.
Does that resonate with you, or are you still? I think you say in this book that you're an atheist. What do you say to that perspective?
Well, yeah, I basically agree with you. I mean, I have been influenced by Sean as well. I mean, he read my earlier book, Small Farm Future, and he kind of said it was, forget his exact words, but it was something along the lines of, this is the best statement of distributism I've read for ages, and I wasn't even that aware of distributism. I sort of came to it from a kind of secular and sort of ecological perspective. So I've had a lot of interesting interactions with Sean over the last 5 years or so, and he's definitely pulled me in that more religious and sacramental direction. I mean, it's hard for me to let go of all my sort of life programming as a kind of coming from a secular atheist point of view, but I do. I'm not the kind of anti-religious kind of Richard Dawkins style of atheist. I think, in a sense, I agree with you that we need some kind of sacramentalism that we've lost. Part of the problem is that you could almost describe modernization in the last few centuries as, some people do, as the death of God. And what we've put in place of God is ourselves, and worshipped ourselves. And that hasn't led to any good results, basically, so I agree with you. And, and partly we can talk about a sort of personal journey where I sort of am on that journey, but, quite a long way, still in the foothills, I would say. But there's also, how this plays out in terms of, human futures, global futures, where I think religion, is going to become more significant, both for good and for ill. But yeah, a sacramental, a sacramental approach to life. I mean, another interesting thinker is Eugene McCarraher's The Enchantments of Mammon, where he sort of basically argued that a kind of secular materialist modern capitalism is essentially the religion of modernism, which is, to use your phrase, evil. It's led us into enormous difficulties and conflicts and crises. So I guess my short answer would be yes, I agree. I'm on that path myself. It's not that easy personally but it's territory I've been exploring. And originally I wanted to write and get more into that, and I was in discussion with Sean about that, and then the world of publishing books being what it is, that ended up as more of a kind of sub theme within this book, and something that I'd like to develop more. But yeah, we need something beyond our sense of the human, and to be aware of those problematic, sinful aspects of being human, in order to get us out of the hole we're in. I do agree.
I gave Sean a heads up that we were interviewing you, and he wanted to make sure I brought up the specter of the Distributist Congress, and how you're feeling about distributism as a movement, at least an intellectual movement at work in the world.
Yeah, I discussed with Sean the possibility of sort of trying to bring together a congress, a meeting of people kind of working on all different aspects of the kind of problems that we've been talking about today, under the banner of distributism. I mean, it's distributism has an interesting history, and it's in some ways it's not an ideal world. It sounds very sort of technical and academic and jargony, but the idea of some of the ideas associated with it, distribution of the means of production and subsidiarity and so on, and the emphasis on sort of family and community, I think are all really important. I mean, I suppose I've come to the conclusion that Sean and I were sort of talking about it seriously at one point, and then I think we both ended up getting pulled off into other work. And I think the conclusion I've come to is I'm not very good at sort of making these kind of things happen, or being an organizer, and and sort of pulling people together in events. But I do think it's a good idea. Whether, I don't know, there's so many different ways in which we can try and effect change, and maybe it goes back to what I was saying earlier. I think we just have to experiment, but I think it would be interesting in that it kind of upsets a lot of our existing mainstream categories, and could bring kind of surprisingly different sorts of people in, under the same roof in interesting ways. So yeah, I'd be interested in it. I mean, I did get some pushback from when I wrote about it from quite traditional Catholics who were a bit scornful about me as a kind of secular sort of non-Catholic thinker. That I remember one person saying, distributism without Catholicism is like socialism, and like, well, I don't think it really is, to be honest. But I do, going back to your previous question, I do think, finding a way back to the sacred is really important in all of this, and it's something that my life and education hasn't really equipped me to do very well, but it's important. But I think I guess all of these kinds of things, it's important to not to enforce purity or purism. It's finding people that you've got enough in common with that you can start to sort of build momentum and build connection, and hopefully good things can come out of that.
Isn't there a distributist party in England? I thought there was.
There is, yes.
Yeah,
a relatively new one. Yeah. Okay. I have. Yeah. I've had some interactions with them. I mean, there are sort of elements of that elements of their platform, it's kind of interesting in terms of the, existing political trends. And I think also maybe the history of distributism in the UK as compared to, the Catholic workers movement, say, in the US, where, distributism in Britain became ultimately quite a conservative movement, in a way that, the Distributors Party in Britain, as I understand it, that they're sort of quite into things like, celebrating Britain's kind of military heritage and patriotism and sort of capital punishment and stuff like that I kind of find it a little bit hard to get behind. But some of the economic ideas, the idea of distributing the means of, in some ways I find all of that sort of patriotic nationalist stuff is actually not very distributist. The whole impetus behind that sort of nationalist celebration of military success is a kind of central state project, and distributism is the antithesis of that. So I have some issues with that, but I think the idea of distributing property, we've got this weird sort of, the existing left-wing, right-wing distinction is sort of odd in that, on the left, you've got this incredibly corporate public ownership, and on the right, incredibly corporate private ownership. But the idea of distributed private ownership at the level of, families, households, communities, it's totally different to the nature of private property, sort of in sort of existing mainstream corporate capitalist society. And that really doesn't get nearly the airing, the public airing that it should do. And that, again, that's where distributism, I think, is the economic thinking behind that is really spot on.
As a wrap-up question, can you tell us about sort of what's the cutting edge of what you're doing and thinking about? And are there further books or anything on the way?
There is potentially some more writing in the offing around the sort of large scale history of farming. I don't know. We'll see. It's very kind of keeping it a little bit under wraps at the moment. But originally, I'd been thinking I'd focus very much more on localism and sort of get more into the ecological history of my little part of the world. But the way life works is suddenly I'm doing all this stuff about global histories. So we'll see how that manifests. That is actually taking me away a little bit from doing farm work and all the things that I should be doing around the place here. But I'm hoping to develop my gardening a little bit more and sort of managing woodland is sort of one of my jobs here that is always full of interest, and managing a bit of livestock. So, as I say, the reality of all this is that we sort of know how to do it, and it's partly fitting it into the larger frameworks of modern life that's a problem. But yeah, I hope to carry on plugging away at that stuff, and then sort of thinking about these bigger structures of history that we need to rethink in the future. So for sure, more writing, but hopefully more farming as well.
All right. Well, unless Laurie has a final question.
No, I just appreciate your time, and very interesting. We have a reading group. I've proposed both of your books for the reading group at some point down in the next year to discuss, because they're just so spot on to what we're doing here, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, great. That's good to hear that. Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for all the work you've done and for talking to us today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, good talking with you guys.